The body was not dead. That was the first thing Phoebe noticed. The shallow rise and fall of the man's chest, barely visible beneath the weight of a fine wool coat gone dark with rain. She had come down Mercer Lane for the same reason she always did at that hour. The Aldgate pharmacy kept odd hours, and Mrs. Linton's fever had climbed 2 degrees since sundown. Phoebe Gault did not have time for unconscious gentlemen in alleyways. She had a patient waiting, a satchel full of remedies, and exactly enough oil left in her lantern to get her home before it guttered out. She walked past him. She made it 4 steps. The sound he made was not quite a groan, more like the noise a man makes when he has forgotten how lungs work and is trying to remember. Phoebe stopped. She stood in the drizzle with her lantern swinging at her side and her eyes fixed on the wall ahead, and she said very quietly, to no one in particular, "Not your business, Phoebe." She went back anyway. He was young, younger than she expected, given the quality of his clothes. Early 30s perhaps, with dark hair plastered against a jaw that had not seen a razor in 2 days. The kind of face that, under better circumstances, would have been almost unsettlingly handsome. Under present circumstances, it was slack and pale and smelled faintly of almonds. Phoebe set her lantern down on the wet cobblestones and crouched beside him. She had been an apothecary's daughter since birth and a qualified dispenser of medicines since the age of 19. When her father's hands had begun to shake too badly to measure powders, she knew the smell of bitter almonds. She knew what it meant. "Laurel water," she said aloud, though there was no one to hear her. Someone had dosed this man with cherry laurel water, not enough to kill him outright, or he would already be dead, but enough to drop him in an alley in Mercer Lane at 1:30 in the morning while his body argued with itself about whether to keep breathing. She checked his pulse, fast and unsteady. His pupils, when she lifted one eyelid, were uneven. "Think," she told herself. "Think like father would." She had to get him upright. Keeping him supine let the compound settle. She needed him moving, or at least sitting. The problem was that he was approximately twice her size, and appeared to have no interest whatsoever in assisting her. It took her the better part of 10 minutes, 1 torn glove, and a vocabulary that would have appalled her late mother to get him to a seated position against the alley wall. He stirred once during the process, blinking at her with those uneven pupils, and said quite distinctly, "You are not Fenwick." "No," Phoebe agreed, breathing hard. "I am not. Where is? I don't know where Fenwick is. Can you stand?" He thought about this for longer than the question warranted. "Possibly," he said, with the careful dignity of a man who is not entirely sure where his legs are. It was not possibly, it was barely. She got him to his feet with his arm across her shoulders and walked him, hauled him, more accurately, in lurching increments, out of Mercer Lane and into the slightly better light of Aldgate Street, where a night watchman took one look at them and crossed to the other side. She brought him to the pharmacy. It was the only option she had. Phoebe Gault had lived above her father's shop on Aldgate Street for all of her 28 years, -3 spent at the Apothecary College in Edinburgh, and 1 disastrous winter in Bath that she did not like to think about. The shop smelled of dried lavender and camphor, and the particular dusty sweetness of 100 labelled glass jars, and it was, in her opinion, the finest place on earth. Her father, Silas Gault, did not agree about the finest, but he agreed it was home, and he was awake when she came through the back door. Because he was always awake these days, his joints too swollen for comfortable sleep, and he took one look at the large unconscious gentleman. His daughter was attempting to manoeuvre through his dispensary, and said, "Phoebe, I know," she said, "that is not Mrs. Linton." Mrs. Linton's fever broke at midnight. "I was on my way home." She steered the man toward the padded bench along the back wall, the one reserved for customers in distress. He was in Mercer Lane. Someone dosed him with laurel water. Her father was already moving toward the shelves, his swollen hands steadier when they had something specific to do. How much? Not a killing dose, enough to incapacitate. She lowered the man onto the bench with considerably more grace than she'd managed in the alley. He was conscious enough to speak when I found him, confused but coherent. Any idea who he is? She had not thought to look. She did now, went through his coat pockets with brisk efficiency, the same way she catalogued unfamiliar compounds. Systematic, impersonal. She found a handkerchief, a pocket watch of extraordinary quality, a card case, and a folded letter with a broken seal. The card read, Ashton Wycliffe, Earl of Briarmore. Phoebe held the card under the lamp for a moment. Then she set it on her father's workbench very carefully, as though it might go off. "We should send for a physician," Silas said. "We are better than any physician he'll get at this hour," Phoebe said. "And if we send for one, we'll spend the next 3 hours explaining how a nobleman ended up in our dispensary at 2 in the morning." Her father looked at the card. He looked at his daughter. He went to put the kettle on. Ashton Wycliffe, Earl of Briarmore, regained full consciousness at 3:15 in the morning, in an apothecary's back room, with a blanket that smelled of lavender over his shoulders and a ceramic cup being pressed into his hands by a woman he had never seen before. "Drink this," she said, slowly. He drank it slowly. It tasted of charcoal and honey and something slightly bitter underneath that he could not name. His head felt as though it had been packed with wet wool, and his mouth tasted foul, and the last thing he clearly remembered was sitting down to supper with Fenwick at the Meridian Club, and then nothing. A gap. And then a cold alley and rain and a woman's voice saying, "Can you stand? You gave me activated charcoal," he said. She looked up from whatever she was writing. "Among other things, you're an apothecary. My father is. I assist him," she said it flatly. The way people say things they have said 100 times and are tired of qualifying. "Can you tell me your name? You already know my name. You went through my pockets." A pause. "Can you tell me your name?" she repeated with the patient emphasis of someone conducting a neurological assessment. He understood then what she was actually asking. "Ashton," he said. "Ashton Wycliffe. The year is 1887. The king is. The queen is Victoria. And I am sitting in an apothecary's dispensary in what I believe is Aldgate." He looked around. "Am I correct?" "You are." She made a note. "Do you remember what you ate or drank this evening before you lost consciousness?" He ran through it. Supper at the club, the lamb, a glass of claret, coffee after. Fenwick had been late. Ashton had waited at the table perhaps 40 minutes before his friend arrived, looking oddly flushed. They had spoken briefly. Fenwick had pressed him to finish his coffee, which had seemed strange at the time, because Fenwick did not usually. "The coffee," Ashton said. She looked up again. "The coffee tasted strange. I thought the club had changed suppliers." He paused. "I should mention that my companion this evening, a Miss George Fenwick, may also require—" "I sent a note to the nearest police station 20 minutes ago," she said, describing the alley and suggesting they check the surrounding streets. "If your Mr. Fenwick is in a similar condition somewhere, they will find him." Ashton looked at her properly for the first time. She was not what he would have called conventionally striking. Medium height, brown hair pulled back with more efficiency than artistry, ink on her left forefinger, a small scar on her chin. She was also, he was increasingly certain, the most competent person he had encountered in some time. "You sent the note before you knew whether I was well enough to warrant involving the authorities," he said. "I sent it as soon as I identified the compound," she said. "Someone poisoned a man tonight. Whether or not that man survived wasn't relevant to the question of whether a crime had been committed. He felt something shift slightly in his chest. Not the compound this time. Something else." "Your name," he said. "You haven't told me." "Gault," she said. "Phoebe Gault." The constable who arrived at 4:30 was young and uncomfortable, and clearly had not anticipated this particular evening. He stood in the dispensary doorway with his notebook open and his pencil hovering, and looked between the Earl of Briarmore and the apothecary's daughter with the expression of a man attempting to assemble a puzzle for which several pieces have been hidden. "And you found his lordship in Mercer Lane, Miss Gault?" "I did. At what time?" 1:30 approximately, and you transported him here." "I did." The constable wrote this down. He looked at his lordship. "And you, my lord, have no memory of how you came to be in Mercer Lane?" "My last memory is of the Meridian Club," Ashton said. "I spoke with Miss Gault about the specific compound involved. She can give you the medical particulars." The constable looked back at Phoebe with renewed uncertainty. Phoebe gave him the medical particulars. She used precise language and did not soften it or simplify it, and he wrote it all down carefully and looked vaguely as though he wished he were somewhere else. Before he left, he turned at the door. I should mention, Miss Gault, we did locate a Mr. Fenwick. He was found in a cab on Threadneedle Street. Conscious, but, he checked his notes, distressed. He's been taken to the hospital. Phoebe felt the Earl go still beside her. Distressed, Ashton said carefully. In what way? I'm afraid I don't have more information than that, my lord. After the constable left, the dispensary was quiet. The lamp had burned low. Silas Gault had fallen asleep in his chair by the stove, his hands folded in his lap, his breathing slow and even. Ashton stood at the workbench, turning his pocket watch over and over in his hands, a habit, Phoebe suspected, rather than any interest in the time. He had not asked to send for a carriage. He had not asked her to wake her father. He had simply stood there, turning the watch, and she had a feeling he was not thinking about Fenwick at all, or not only about Fenwick. You're thinking about who had access to your coffee, she said. He looked at her. That is a perceptive observation. It's a logical one. The club's staff would have access, obviously. But if the coffee tasted strange, the compound was likely added at the table, which suggests someone in the dining room. You said Fenwick was late and flushed when he arrived. A long silence. You're suggesting Fenwick was coerced. I'm suggesting he may have been threatened or frightened into facilitating something he didn't fully understand. She paused. Or I'm wrong entirely, and the kitchen staff made an extraordinary error. But you don't believe that? Ashton set the watch down on the bench. No, he said quietly. I don't. He came back the next afternoon. Phoebe had spent the morning doing what she always did, filling prescriptions, labelling compounds, helping her father with the weekly inventory. She had not thought about the Earl of Briarmore. She had not thought about his coat or his careful diction, or the way he had looked at her across the workbench, as though she was saying something that required close attention. She had absolutely not thought about any of those things. He arrived at 4 o'clock, without a card, without fanfare, in a plain dark coat that was considerably less fine than the one he'd been wearing the night before. He came to the pharmacy door the way customers came to it, not to the side entrance, not in a carriage, and the bell above the door rang in the ordinary way. Lord Briarmore, Phoebe said, from behind the counter. Miss Gault. He looked around the shop with what appeared to be genuine interest. At the jars ranked in their rows, at the labels in her father's cramped handwriting, at the mortar and pestle on the counter that she had been using when he walked in. I wanted to thank you properly, and to tell you what I've learned. She set down the pestle. What have you learned? He told her. Fenwick was recovering, but in a bad state. He had, in fact, been approached 3 days prior by a woman who had told him she needed his help with a small matter, and had made clear, in terms that admitted no ambiguity, that refusal would cost Fenwick's younger brother his position. His brother being employed in a certain firm whose senior partner was a man, Fenwick could not afford to antagonize. The woman had given Fenwick a small paper packet and told him to empty it into Ashton's coffee. He didn't know what it was, Ashton said. He thought it would simply make me ill. Make me cancel an appointment I had the following morning. What appointment? Ashton was quiet for a moment. A meeting at my solicitor's office. I have been engaged in a legal matter for the past several months. A dispute over the disposition of property that had been promised to me under the terms of my late uncle's will, but which a third party has been contesting. He paused. The contesting party is a Mrs. Cordelia Mourne. She was briefly engaged to my uncle before his death. Phoebe processed this. She didn't inherit what she expected. She inherited considerably less than she expected, Ashton said, and she has been methodical about addressing that. She's contested the will before, twice, unsuccessfully. He met her eyes. I was to sign the final transfer documents at 9 o'clock yesterday morning. If I had failed to appear, the transfer had been delayed. Phoebe leaned against the counter, giving her time to file another challenge. Or worse, there is a clause. He hesitated. I'd rather not go into the full particulars, but there is a clause in the original will that creates a window, a period of 30 days following my uncle's anniversary of death, during which, if I were to be deemed legally incapacitated, the estate would revert temporarily to a trustee of Mrs. Mourne's choosing. He said it flatly, the way people say things that have cost them a great deal of careful thought. Yesterday was the 28th day of that window. Phoebe stared at him. She wasn't trying to make you miss an appointment. No! She was trying to have you declared incapacitated. A man found insensible in a Mercer Lane alley at 2 in the morning, reeking of a compound that causes confusion and erratic behaviour, with no memory of how he got there. Ashton's voice was even. It would not have been difficult to construct a case. The dispensary felt very quiet suddenly. The sounds of Aldgate Street, carts, voices, the distant clatter of a hansom, filtered through the window as though from a great distance. "You signed the documents?" Phoebe asked. "I signed them at noon yesterday." A few hours later than planned, but signed. A very small, dry smile. "Your charcoal treatment was effective." She did not smile back. She was thinking about Mrs. Cordelia Mourne, who had looked at a legal window of 30 days and seen an opportunity, who had found a frightened man with a vulnerable brother and used him without hesitation, who had calculated that a dosed nobleman in a dark alley was a tidier solution than another expensive legal challenge. "She'll know it failed," Phoebe said. "Yes. Will she try again?" Ashton looked at her for a long moment. "That is the question I came here to ask your opinion about," he said, "because you identified what was done to me before any physician was involved, and you sent for the constable before you knew whether I would survive to press charges, and your instinct about Fenwick was correct within 6 hours of hearing a 3-sentence account." He paused. "I find myself wanting the opinion of someone with that quality of judgment." Phoebe picked up the pestle again, not because she needed it, but because she needed something to do with her hands. "What does your solicitor say?" "That we have sufficient grounds to pursue criminal charges against Mrs. Mourne, but that the evidence is largely circumstantial. Fenwick's account places the compound in his possession, but the chain between him and Mrs. Mourne is one conversation in a private drawing room, with no witnesses." "What does Fenwick say she looks like?" Ashton told her. Phoebe nodded slowly. "I know a Mrs. Mourne," she said. "Not well. She has used this pharmacy twice, once for a preparation for nerve pain, once for something she described as a tonic for low spirits. I remember because both times she paid in coin rather than opening an account, which is unusual for a woman of her apparent station." She paused, "and because the second time she came, she asked my father whether laurel water was available in compound form, or only as a raw preparation. Father told her only raw. He thought she was concerned about accidental ingestion." The silence stretched. "She was conducting research," Ashton said. "Into the availability of the compound," Phoebe agreed, "which may or may not be sufficient to. It is a great deal more than we had 20 minutes ago." He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely categorize. Not gratitude exactly, not surprise exactly. Something that sat between the two and had its own particular weight. "Miss Gault, I need to speak with my solicitor and with the constable assigned to this matter. Would you be willing to give a formal account of Mrs. Mourne's visit to this pharmacy?" "Yes," Phoebe said. She said it without hesitation, the way she had gone back down Mercer Lane. Not because it was convenient, but because the alternative was simply not one she was able to choose. The investigation took 11 days. She would not have called them ordinary days. They were not, but they had a kind of rhythm to them that she found steadying. Her work continued. Prescriptions, compounds, her father's accounts, Mrs. Linton's follow-up tincture, the regular Tuesday delivery to the Foundling Hospital on Crispin Street. The matter of Ashton Wickliffe and Cordelia Mourne ran alongside all of it, parallel and urgent, surfacing in the form of notes delivered to the pharmacy door, and twice in the form of Ashton himself. She learned things about him during those 11 days, in the way you learn things about a person without intending to. He was precise about language. He listened in a way that was rarer than it should have been, fully, without formulating his reply while she was still speaking. He had a dry, contained sense of humour that emerged in the margins of serious conversations, and he deployed it sparingly enough that she was never quite sure whether it was intentional or accidental, which she suspected was also intentional. She learned that he had managed his uncle's estate since the age of 23, when his uncle's health had first declined, and he had stepped in to handle the business of it without being asked. She learned that he had a younger sister, recently married, about whom he spoke with the particular warmth of a man who has been responsible for someone and is relieved to find them happy. She learned that he took his coffee without sugar, that he read the newspaper front to back rather than starting with the correspondence pages as most people did, and that he found the current fashion for overheated drawing rooms genuinely difficult, which she found hilarious for reasons she could not quite explain. On the 5th day, he asked her to call him Ashton. She said she'd think about it. On the 7th day, she called him Ashton, and he looked at her as though she'd handed him something he hadn't expected to receive. Cordelia Mourne was 41 years old, twice widowed, and possessed of a legal mind that several barristers had described, privately and with some resentment, as excellent. She had contested Reginald Wycliffe's will on the grounds that his nephew had exerted undue influence over a dying man, an argument that had failed twice, for the simple reason that Ashton had not, in fact, exerted any such influence. His uncle had simply loved him more than he had loved his fiancée, a fact that Cordelia Mourne found both accurate and infuriating. The charges against her rested on 3 things: Fenwick's account of their meeting, Phoebe's record of her inquiries at the pharmacy, and a letter found in a search of her correspondence, a letter addressed to a man in Spitalfields who had, it emerged, a history of supplying controlled compounds through informal channels. The letter did not mention cherry laurel water by name. It did not need to. Phoebe gave her account before a magistrate on a Thursday morning. She sat in a straight-backed chair in a room that smelled of old paper and gas lamps, and she spoke clearly and without embellishment, the way her father had taught her to speak about compounds. Precisely, in sequence, without speculation about what it all meant. Afterwards, in the corridor outside, Ashton found her. That was... He stopped. Accurate, she suggested. I was going to say remarkable. You were going to say something more than that, she said. And then you decided against it. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his expression that she had been carefully not looking at for 11 days, because she was a practical woman who did not do impractical things, and whatever this was, whatever had been building in the odd space between solicitors' offices and pharmacy counters and conversations that went on longer than they needed to, was wildly impractical. Yes, he said. I suppose I was. They stood in the corridor while the magistrate's clerk walked past with a sheaf of papers, and a solicitor's assistant came through a side door and then went back out, and the building went about its business around them. I find, Ashton said carefully, that I have become accustomed to your judgment. You mean you found it useful? I mean... He stopped again, started again. I mean that I think about conversations with you when we are not having them. I mean that I came back to your pharmacy on Thursday not only because of the matter of Mrs. Mourne, but because I wanted to. He paused. I don't know if that is information you want. I'm aware that I am saying it in a corridor outside a magistrate's office, which is not. It's fine, Phoebe said. I prefer direct, then directly. I should like to call on you. Properly, not about a legal matter. She thought about Mercer Lane. She thought about the smell of almonds and the sound of breathing that was not quite right, and the 4 steps she had taken before she went back. She thought about a man turning a pocket watch over and over in his hands, and the way he looked at her when she said something that required close attention. Properly would be acceptable, she said. Something happened to his face that she was fairly sure, on reflection, she would remember for a long time. Cordelia Mourne was tried in the spring and convicted on 2 counts. The Meridian Club quietly retired several members of its kitchen staff, and George Fenwick gave an account of himself to a panel of investigators that was not flattering, but was honest, and in the end he kept his position, and his brother kept his, and the whole thing was, as Ashton put it, resolved to the satisfaction of everyone except Mrs. Mourne. Silas Gault, when Ashton came to the pharmacy to ask his permission to court his daughter, shook his hand for a very long time, and then said that Phoebe would not thank either of them for having this conversation without her, and Phoebe, who had been in the dispensary the entire time and had elected to stay there rather than come out, said from behind the door, "He's right, I won't." It was not a conventional arrangement. Phoebe kept the pharmacy, not as a hobby, not as a pastime, but as a profession, the same way she had always kept it. She expanded the dispensary the following year with the addition of a back room better suited to compounding, and she trained a young woman from Crispin Street who had, in Phoebe's estimation, excellent instincts and terrible handwriting. What she and Ashton had, in the end, was not what either of them had expected when the year began. It was stranger and quieter and better, the way things sometimes are when they come about sideways, through a decision made in a dark lane in the rain, to go back and find out whether a man is breathing. He was, as it turned out. That seemed worth something.